Next slide, please. So I saw something in the news this week, and you may have missed it, but hopefully you saw this picture in the news this week. This is a picture from taken underneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent in Nazareth. It is a picture of the doorway to a first century house, a small house that is partially carved out of rock and partially built primarily with stones. And the house is next to, underneath the convent, is this house, a significant burial area around it, a cave church, which dates from maybe the 2nd century, which is immediately adjacent to the house, and the remains of a church that was built during the Byzantine era and a church that was built during the Crusader era. The guys that are doing the work here believe that all these churches going back to the cave church in the 2nd century are built next to or over this house in Nazareth for a reason. And that this is the house that Jesus lived in when he was a boy. And this is the doorway that he passed through many thousands of times. So this was in the news this week. A guy named Ken Dark from the University of Reading is the lead archaeologist on this project. There was the Byzantine, the people that built the Byzantine church did some archaeology of the time at this site, and the Sisters of Nazareth believed that their convent is built on top of the house of Jesus. The Byzantine church was built in the 5th century, the previous church was visited, as in the Chronicle of Egeria, the woman who came from either Spain or Gaul in the 4th century and toured many sites in what we now think of as the Holy Land. It's on her chronology of things that she visited and saw. But the photo has the doorway into the house and the only floor section that seems to be original from the 1st century. So this is probably a place that Jesus actually walked. In any case, when you run into people who think that, there's really no evidence, there's no physical stuff, no, there really is. And a lot of things have been preserved because churches and other things were built over them, partly to protect them and also to honor them. But this is the doorway into a 1st century house in Nazareth, and potentially the house that Jesus grew up in. At least it's been honored for most of 2 millennia as that house. So anyway, that was interesting in the news this week, and I thought I should point that out to you in case you missed it. So next slide, please. So we're talking through the various apostles here and what happened to them and where did they go. So I wanted to spend a bunch of time this morning talking about the apostle who is associated with an island. Which apostle is associated with an island? John. The island at the top right here is the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, south and west of the ancient city of Ephesus. Patmos was used as a place of exile for many years by the Romans. At the bottom right there is the monastery of St. John on the island of Patmos. That goes back many years, back to I think the 3rd century, and is built on older ruins. And the painting of John here is, once again, by Guido Reni, done in the early 1600s. John is often depicted in paintings as a young man. And when he's depicted as a young man, he's almost always depicted without a beard. He's almost always depicted as clean-shaven, or maybe not being quite old enough to be able to grow a beard. There is a lot of belief that John was the youngest of the 12, and that as the youngest of the 12, he may have been, 18 or something when he first became a disciple of Jesus. And he is often depicted writing. He, of course, is the author of the Gospel of John, 3 epistles of John, and the Revelation. That's about 20% of the New Testament that he wrote. Now, he didn't write in a book that had a spine like that. That's 1,000 years or more later. But he is often depicted writing. So John, known as John the Evangelist or John the Theologian by some, the younger brother of James the Greater, one of the sons of thunder. And of course, we spent a little time talking about what does that potentially mean. And keep in mind that the sons of thunder, John and his older brother James, are the guys that after a Samaritan village refused to believe and to respond to the gospel, James and John were the two of the 12 that asked Jesus, would you like us to call down fire from heaven to destroy that village and all the people in it? So there is a sons of thunder thing built into that. But John is the son of Zebedee, a fisherman from Capernaum, probably born in Bethsaida. And he's known in John's gospel, John writing about himself, calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that shows up in John's gospel at least six times. And actually echoes a term used by Daniel earlier, the man that God loved, in Daniel chapter 10. So the disciple whom Jesus loved thing has been kind of a conundrum down through the years. People down through the years have figured that the person writing must be referring to a different person, and that therefore John and the disciple whom Jesus loved have to be two different people. This is one of the things that got some of the Mary Magdalene stuff started over the last 200 years. That maybe Mary Magdalene is the disciple whom Jesus loved, and maybe that meant they're romantic, that they were romantically connected. And so that's a thing that has been part of the popular culture for the last couple of centuries, but not before that. But in the first century, it was really uncommon to write in the first person unless you were writing a personal letter. So you see the epistles are written in the first person. I, we, kinds of stuff. I have been praying for you. I am worried about you kinds of things. You see that in Paul's letters and the other, the epistle of James and John's epistles. But the four Gospels, basically nothing is in the first person. Matthew is writing as one of the 12. And yet, when he refers to Matthew, he doesn't say me or I, he says Matthew. He names himself in the third person. So Mark refers to himself in his gospel once towards the end and just says the young man, a young man, and doesn't even name himself, but once again talks about himself in the third person. So John uses the disciple whom Jesus loved when he wants to refer to himself. He doesn't say me, and he doesn't say John. He says the disciple whom Jesus loved. But people have always wanted to make that more complicated, and I think that's that there's oceans of ink have been spilled on this point, but I think it's almost all trying to make things more complicated than they are. People who wrote at the time mostly, if they were trying to write something that was historical, they mostly wrote in the third person. And so I think that's entirely consistent with that. But John, as a young man, as a very young man, probably as a teenager, was a disciple of John the Baptist before he was a disciple of Jesus. He and Andrew, Peter's brother, appeared to have been followers of John the Baptist, and they appeared to be the two guys that John the Baptist, upon seeing Jesus, said, "Behold the Lamb of God," and they went off and followed Jesus and spent the day with him. John and his brother James may be cousins of Jesus. There's a possibility that their mother, Salome, was a sister of Mary. So, but John is one of the three who are at the Transfiguration. He's one of the three who's at the healing of the daughter of Jairus, where Jesus just brings three of his disciples in to see that. And he's one of the three that are brought aside during the prayer at Gethsemane before he is arrested. And in John 19, Jesus on the cross gives responsibility for his mother to John, which has caused a lot of people to wonder down through the ages, what does that mean and what's going on with that? And then there is the whole bit in John chapter 21 where Jesus restores Peter after he's denied him 3 times and gives him the call to feed my sheep 3 times. And then Peter almost immediately turns around and says, well, what about that guy? About John? And Jesus says, what's it to you? What's it to you if he remains till the end of the age? What's it to you? And people since then have built a whole mythos around John that Jesus, in so saying, was either predicting something in particular or that he was conferring some kind of protection on John or making some statement about the power that John was going to be infused with. But this led to expectations down through the ages that John could not be martyred, that he could not be killed. And so there are traditions associated with the life of John that have him escaping death because of that are built on this idea that John would live to a great age and die in his own bed, and so that he could not be killed. There's a very strong tradition, of course, that John is the only one of the 12 who was not martyred, and that he was the last to die, and that he didn't die until the end of the 1st century. So it is likely that he wrote the Gospel of John after about AD 80. So pretty late and well after the other Gospels were written, and that his 3 epistles are from the early 90s, and that the Revelation is written in the mid-90s. So that his writings are really the last writings of the New Testament that were done. Paul's writings, of course. 2 Timothy, we're looking at AD 65, maybe 64, probably no later than 66. And John probably doesn't begin writing his gospel until AD 80. Well after both Peter and Paul have been martyred, more than a decade later, John is writing. His epistles, 1 John is a general letter addressed to kind of the whole church. 2 John is to the elect lady. And there are few clues as to who that person was. There is an early tradition that the elect lady was Mary, the mother of Jesus. No evidence to back that up, but there is some possibility that that's true. And 3 John is to somebody named Gaius, There are three men named Gaius in the New Testament, one in Acts 19 who's at Macedonia, one in Acts 20 who's at Derbe, and one in Romans 16 who's at Corinth. None of those are people that it's obvious that John would have had any interaction with based on where he went and what his ministry was. So hard to know exactly who he's writing to in 2 John and 3 John. There's never been a strong argument for any particular person that those letters are written to. So in his life and ministry, John is closely associated with Peter in the early part of Acts. In Acts chapter 3, they are together and a man is healed in the temple, on the steps of the temple, at the temple gate. In Acts chapter 4, they're arrested together and held together and then brought before the Sanhedrin together. In Acts chapter 8, they go to Samaria together to investigate this outbreak of the gospel in Samaria. He apparently remained in Jerusalem for some time. When Paul visits from Antioch, he names three men as what he calls the pillars of the church, which are Peter and John and James the Just. He was apparently in Jerusalem for the church council, the first Jerusalem council in Acts chapter 15, that's AD 50, so more than a decade after the resurrection, and it indicates that all the apostles were there, and so that perhaps they all had stayed a dozen or more years, maybe close to 20 years, mostly in Jerusalem after the resurrection. John must have left Jerusalem before the siege began in AD 66. He's not associated with that story. That's a story that's primarily focused on James the Just, but nobody knows when John left Jerusalem or where he initially went. At the time of 2 Timothy, about AD 64, Paul is writing to Timothy, and Timothy is at Ephesus. And Paul does not mention John, and so that's probably too early for John to have been at Ephesus. But John is very strongly associated with Ephesus in his later life. It's the one place that we are absolutely certain after Jerusalem and some minor time in Samaria that John spent time in his ministry. Eusebius has the apostles drawing lots at some point after AD 50 on where they would go, breaking up the world. And it's one of the things that really irritates me about Eusebius is Eusebius, who spends chapters and chapters on the succession of the bishops of Caesarea and Antioch and that sort of stuff, starts off on this story about the apostles drew lots and this is where they went, and he names three names, and then he gets distracted and goes off to something else and never comes back to that part of the story. And that's the part that I was most interested in. So I'm disappointed in Eusebius because of that. But one of the three that he names is John, and he says John went to Asia. Now this is the Roman province of Asia, not the continent of Asia. The Roman province of Asia is based around the city of Ephesus and includes a number of the 7 churches of the Revelation that are listed in the first part of the book of Revelation. Those churches are all in the greater Ephesus area, and most of them were in or very near to the Roman province of Asia. So those are likely 7 churches that John, with a ministry that was focused on in Ephesus, probably had relationships with and had visited. But it appears that he does not go to Ephesus until after 2 Timothy has been written, and probably until after the death of Paul around AD 64, 65. But that he had left Jerusalem by AD 66 when the siege began. So at some point in that point, John goes to Asia and ends up in Ephesus. he is exiled to Patmos from Ephesus, and he writes the Revelation there. And his tomb at Ephesus dates before the 4th century, at least, and probably much earlier than that. So next slide. This is the cave of the Apocalypse on Patmos. So the right-hand side of the picture is the ancient cave, and you can see that they built a church, an arched, vaulted church off the front of the cave. And so you can see here in the upper center section, you can see that they built off the cave ledge there to create a church that expands off. But the right-hand side, you can see the overhang of the cave, and down underneath that is allegedly the place that John, the apostle, lived when he was on Patmos. So there is a church there that is associated with him, long since expanded into a church, and with marble flooring now. But there in the right-hand side is the portion that is the ancient cave, in which is associated with John having lived under this rock overhang during his time on Patmos. Now, Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century, in his book, The Prescription Against Heretics, says that under the Emperor Domitian, John was arrested in Ephesus in around 80 AD and taken to Rome to be tried before the emperor. And that the emperor convicted him and sentenced him to be boiled to death in oil in a big vat. So the Romans thought about ways to kill people, so the Emperor Domitian was engaged in a persecution of those that he thought, once again, as most Roman emperors were, of those he thought were a threat to the regime. And he had heard about these Christians, and somehow he apparently heard that one of Jesus' 12 disciples was still alive. And so he said, "Find that man and bring him here. I want to know if he's a threat." And having interviewed John, he decided that he was a threat and sentenced him to death. Tertullian says John was dropped into the vat of boiling oil and he didn't die. In fact, he wasn't seriously affected by it. And so that eventually they pulled him out of the vat of boiling oil. And one thing that is a tradition among the Romans going back very, very early in their time was that if you were sentenced to death, if you were sentenced to be executed, and the execution was botched in some way so that you didn't die, you were regarded as having the favor of the gods. And having received the favor of the gods, you were not allowed to be executed again. There was, double jeopardy or something. So that if there was an attempt to kill somebody, to execute somebody by whatever means, and it failed, that then they couldn't do anything else to you. They couldn't kill you. So Tertullian says that John was plunged into the boiling oil, came out unhurt, and that's why Domitian exiled him to Patmos. Was because he had to do something with him and he could no longer kill him. Tertullian says this happened around AD 81, and that John remained on Patmos until Domitian died in 96, so 15 years. Says Tertullian, that John was exiled on Patmos. When I think about John on Patmos and writing the Revelation, it usually seems in my mind that he was there for some months. But Tertullian says he was there for 15 years. And they lived under this rock ledge for 15 years in exile. There is you can't see it in the picture, but there is a fissure through the rock that comes down into this place, into this area that opens up kind of to the sky. And it's really echoey, apparently. And so there are those that have long thought that that the voice from heaven that got the revelation started is the voice echoing down through this passage in the rock into this spot that John was apparently living. So when Domitian died, Domitian was almost immediately put out of favor. He was unpopular with the Senate. The new emperor was a guy named Nerva, who was elderly and had deep connections with the Senate. And Nerva in the Senate released all the people that Domitian had jailed or exiled. They overturned all the things that Domitian had done. Just because they decided that Domitian was bad and they didn't want to have anything to do with him. So John was released after Domitian died in 96 AD and apparently went back to Ephesus where he lived some more years. Various accounts of his death have him dying sometime between 98 and 106. So sometime in the next few years, 98 is or 100 AD is one of the most widely accepted, which would be another 4 years. And John would have been in his 90s, having been born sometime between about AD 6 and AD 10, depending on the source that you're using and the estimates that you're making. Maybe even a little bit later than that if you think he came to be a disciple of Jesus at maybe 17 or 18. He would have been a little bit younger than that. But probably in his 90s when he died. There's another tradition that is goes with the early time in John's, goes early in the history of John, and that was that somebody tried to kill him by handing him a chalice of wine, which was poisoned. And that when John took the chalice into his hand, the poison formed itself into a serpent, and the serpent slithered out of the chalice and dropped on the ground. And so early depictions of John often have him holding a chalice with a serpent sticking out of it. So another thing that's related to this idea that perhaps he could not be killed. So there are some ancient sources that say that in his last years, John traveled around, or maybe just sitting in Ephesus, appointed bishops for many of the churches in the western part of Asia Minor, across the province of Asia, that the 7 churches of the Revelation all had bishops that were appointed by John, and that he appointed some bishops around the northern Aegean Sea as well, in places like Thessalonica and Philippi. And there is some tradition that says in his very last years, John was carried from where he lived to church on Sunday because he could no longer physically do the walk. And so young men from the church went and picked him up and carried him to church. And the thing that he would say all the time was, "Little children, love one another." And then when somebody asked him, "Why do you always say that?" he said, "If we do that, it is enough." So Patmos became a major Christian pilgrimage site from about the 4th century, but after about the 7th century, it was largely abandoned because of Muslim piracy and raiding, and so it was not used for a long time as a result of that. Today, Patmos, of course, is a place that you can get a cruise ship to go to. It's a cruise ship destination. So late in his life, John discipled Polycarp, who became the Bishop of Smyrna. He discipled Ignatius, who became the Bishop of Antioch. He discipled Papias, who became the Bishop of Hierapolis. And so men that we think of as the apostolic fathers, as the fathers of the church, in the late first and into the second century. John has fingerprints on 3 of those guys who became very important figures in the early church. And Polycarp, of course, discipled Irenaeus, who wrote extensively about the early church, primarily about theological controversies, and has numerous references to John in his writings, which are almost certainly because Irenaeus got those things from Polycarp, who got those things from John. So next slide, please. So this is the tomb of John. It's at Seljuk in Turkey, about 2 miles from ancient Ephesus. It is the centerpiece of an ancient cathedral, the Basilica of St. John. The basilica that the remains of are here was built under the Emperor Justinian between 548 and 565. The altar font had carved on it Psalm 132:14. "This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell." Procopius of Caesarea in the 6th century says, "There chanced to be a certain place before the city of Ephesus, lying on a steep slope, hilly and bare of soil, and incapable of producing crops, even should one attempt to cultivate them, but altogether hard and rough. On that site, the natives had set up a church in early times to the Apostle John. This apostle has been named the theologian because the nature of God was described by him in a manner beyond the unaided power of man." That would be a reference to the first chapter of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This church, which was small and in a ruined condition because of its great age, the Emperor Justinian tore down to the ground and replaced by a church so large and beautiful that, to speak briefly, it resembles very closely in all respects and is a rival to the shrine which is dedicated to all the apostles in the imperial city, which would be Constantinople at the time that he's writing. That was in Procopius's book, The Buildings. In his book, The Secret History, he makes reference to the sanctuary of the Apostle John, which was the most holy one in Asia and held in very high honor. This is the church that was built in between 548 and 565 under the Emperor Justinian. A previous church had been built on the site in the 4th century under Theodosius, and that church was built over the top of a mausoleum, so a burial place, and apparently an important burial place. Next slide. This is the overhead view. Down in the bottom center is the part that we were just looking at from the other direction, but you can see the same pillars and the same arc from the front of the church. But the church is laid out as a cross, and we're looking down from the head of the cross in this direction. But this is the church that was built under Emperor Justinian in the middle of the 6th century. John is interesting in that of the 12, he's the only one that nobody claims to have his body or any part of his body or any relics from his earthly existence. John's the only one of the 12. Everyone else, there is some place where people claim to have part of his body, where he's claimed to be buried somewhere, where there are relics that are associated with him. John's the only one. And yet John is the one that we know, to a greater extent than any of the other 12 except for Peter, we know where John probably died. And there's a tomb. Here's the thing about the tomb. Hippolytus, a disciple of Irenaeus, who was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, Hippolytus says that the remains of John, his body, could not be found. That after his death, no one could find his body. The Emperor Constantine had this tomb opened because Constantine was collecting relics of the apostles. And Constantine reported that when the tomb of John was open, it was empty, and that there was no real evidence that it had ever been filled with anything other than air. In more recent years, the Turkish authorities in this area have consistently told people that the contents of the tomb were removed by British archaeologists and taken to the British Museum. But the British Museum doesn't have any holdings that have to do with the Apostle John and denies having anything to do with that. The tomb is really a memorial. It's not really a grave. And there are early legends that say that John was taken up by God, not in a chariot of fire like Elijah, but that nonetheless he was taken up by God. There is an early legend that says that Jesus himself visited John around 100 AD and told him that after he preached the following Sunday that he would be taken up to heaven. So that gives you something to think about if you're going to go preach the sermon, that, this is really my last one.
Is this picture modern-day Greece?
This is in modern-day Turkey. So this is about 2 miles from the ancient city of Ephesus in western Turkey. The town that this is near is now called Seljuk, but this is still there. You can go visit it. So you can go see the place. So in any case, so there's some interesting stories about John and about what happened to him. But John is very, very strongly associated with the city of Ephesus in his later life, and there's no reason to believe that he was somewhere other than Ephesus from at least AD 80 on, and probably earlier than that. And he's not really associated with any other place except for Jerusalem and briefly Samaria. There's no traditions about John that go anywhere else. There's nothing else that he is really strongly associated with. Here's the other thing about, the other really interesting thing about the Apostle John and the city of Ephesus. Next slide. So, there's a hill, Mount Keresos, that overlooks the ancient city of Ephesus. And up on top of the hill is this. This is known as the House of the Virgin Mary. Now, I visited this, I've toured this. I can tell you that inside there's a plaque that says that thanks all the donors who helped to rebuild this house in the 1950s. But it's built on an ancient foundation. And it's built not very far from a very large baptismal pool that dates to the 1st century. So, it's a nice site. It catches the breeze. It's got a nice view. It's not very convenient to the town, but if you weren't going to personally have to go into town, this is a nice place. And it was revered by local Christians long before the 19th century, but it has been a shrine only since the 1890s. So the oldest parts of the house are actually marked in red. So you can tell which parts go all the way back. There are people that visit it now and want to touch the parts that go way, way back into the 1st century. And so those parts are marked off in red on the inside so you can see which parts are there. It's a 2-room house. It's got a large meeting living room kind of space, which is now the chapel, and a small sleeping room. 3 Roman Catholic popes have visited this house in the last 130 years. The Roman Catholic Church does not officially say that this is the house that Mary lived in her later years. However, Jesus on the cross made John responsible for his mom. And for a mother of a 30-year-old man, she wasn't that old. She was maybe 45. She was not 50 years old at the time of the resurrection. So it's possible that she lived for some significant years thereafter. Now, there is a tradition in a church that is built in a place outside of Jerusalem that claims to be the place where Mary was carried up to heaven in AD 41. But Epiphanes of Salamis, the bishop of Salamis in Cyprus in the late 4th century, places Mary at Ephesus, and Epiphanes was a very staunch defender of orthodoxy. He was a fighter against all manner of heresies. He wrote a lengthy book about the heresies of the day with very specific rebuttals. He served as bishop for about 40 years and showed up, was a significant voice at a couple of different church councils in that era. So he's a pretty solid source. Now, 4th century, so 200 years after these events, or 250, something like that. But Epiphanes seems to think that maybe the house of Mary is true. So anyway, you can go see it. I have. It's an interesting tour, and it's a nice location, but really hard to say. There's over 1,000 years where this property is not accounted for by anybody. So there's not, the sort of chain of custody that you might like to see for an ancient site. But there was a 1st century house that was built on the hill overlooking Ephesus. And there's a long tradition that maybe Mary lived out her last years there. Next slide. So we talked about James and James and James, and we talked about Judas and Judas and Judas. Here are 7 Marys from the New Testament. And we'll talk about these primarily next week, but I want to point out to you that in the 1st century, Mary was the single most popular female name in Judea and Galilee. And that estimates based on tombs and early records and other things guess that something like 20% of all the girls that were born at that time into that culture were named Mary. So easily the most common female name of the day, and easily the most common female name in the New Testament. I took a quick look. In the Roman Catholic tradition alone, I found, just in a few minutes looking, I found 10 women who are known as Saint Mary. So if you're going to try to keep your Marys straight, you've got to be pretty careful because there are a bunch of them. So next week we'll talk about Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Mary of Clopas, Mary, the sister of Martha, Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Mary, the mother of John Mark, and Mary of Rome, who are 7 of the Marys in the New Testament, and maybe not all of them, but I think it's enough. So. Anyway, but this is even more complicated than the James and Judas stuff. So we'll spend a little time on this next time. Anyway.